Have you ever wondered what it was like to lose everything you once held dear, one breath at a time? In the shadows of old Shanghai's gleaming foreign concessions and bustling markets, there lived thousands of souls whose stories have been forgotten by history. These weren't the wealthy merchants or powerful warlords that fill the history books. These were ordinary people whose lives became extraordinary in their tragedy, bound together by a single thread that would ultimately unravel everything they knew. Tonight, I'm going to share with you the deeply human stories of opium addicts in old Shanghai during the late Qing dynasty and early Republican period. These aren't just statistics or dates to memorize. These are real people who loved, hoped, dreamed, and suffered in ways that will both break your heart and help you understand a chapter of human experience that shaped an entire city. Picture this. The year is 1895, and Shanghai has become a city unlike anywhere else on Earth. Foreign settlements sprawl along the Huangpu River, their European-style buildings standing in stark contrast to the traditional Chinese neighborhoods that surround them. Gas lamps flicker to life as evening falls, casting long shadows down cobblestone streets where rickshaw pullers weave between horse-drawn carriages and the occasional motor car. The air itself tells a story. During the day, it carries the scent of jasmine tea from the traditional tea houses, the salt tang of the river, and the rich aroma of street food vendors frying dumplings and noodles. But as night descends, another scent mingles with these familiar smells. It's sweet, cloying, and unmistakable to those who know it. The smell of opium smoke drifting from countless pipes throughout the city. In this world lived Chen Wei, a silk merchant's son who had everything a young man could want. His family owned a prosperous shop in the Chinese Quarter, dealing in the finest silks that would eventually make their way to European drawing rooms and American parlors. Chen had received a classical education, could recite poetry with the best of them, and was betrothed to the daughter of another merchant family. His future seemed as bright and carefully woven as the silk his family sold. The first time Chen tried opium, he was 23 years old. It happened at a business dinner with some of his father's associates from the foreign settlement. The meal had gone well, contracts had been signed, and as was customary, the men retired to a private room where pipes were offered. Chen had heard about the foreign smoke, as some called it, but had never partaken. His hosts insisted it would be rude to refuse such hospitality. He still remembered that first draw from the long bamboo pipe. The smoke was smoother than he had expected, almost sweet on his tongue. Within minutes, a warmth spread through his body, unlike anything he had ever experienced. The constant worry about business, about living up to his father's expectations, about his upcoming marriage to a woman he barely knew, all of it simply melted away. For the first time in years, Chen felt truly at peace. That night, he told himself it was just a one-time experience, something to satisfy his curiosity. But 3 days later, he found himself walking past the establishment where they had smoked. A week after that, he was inside, paying for his own pipe. Within a month, he was visiting every other day. Within 3 months, it was daily. The progression was so gradual that Chen barely noticed it happening. At first, he maintained his work at the family shop, his studies, his social obligations. He told himself he had everything under control. The opium wasn't interfering with his life, it was enhancing it. After a long day of dealing with difficult customers or memorizing classical texts, the pipe offered a perfect retreat into tranquility. But opium has its own timeline, its own rules, and it waits for no one. Chen's betrothed, Mei Lin, began to notice changes in him during their chaperoned meetings. Where once his eyes had been bright and alert, now they seemed distant, dreamy. His conversation, once witty and engaging, became scattered and strange. Sometimes he would nod off mid-sentence, then wake with a start and claim he had been thinking deeply about what she had said. His father noticed too. Mistakes began appearing in the shop's records. Orders were forgotten or filled incorrectly. Chen, who had once been meticulous about every detail of the business, now seemed to float through his duties like a man walking through a dream. The family held meetings about Chen's strange behavior. His mother worried he was ill. His father suspected he was keeping bad company. His younger sister, always the most perceptive of the family, whispered to her mother that she had smelled something sweet and strange on Chen's clothes, something that reminded her of the incense burned at certain temples, but different somehow. It was Mei Lin who finally discovered the truth. During one of their meetings, Chen had excused himself, claiming he felt unwell, but instead of going to rest, he had slipped away to a nearby opium den. Mei Lin, concerned for her future husband and tired of his mysterious behavior, had quietly followed him. She watched from across the street as he entered a narrow building squeezed between a noodle shop and a tailor. The building looked respectable enough from the outside, with clean windows and a freshly painted door. But she noticed the men who entered walked with a particular gait, slow and dreamy, and those who left moved with either the same dreamy quality or with the jerky, anxious movements of those who needed something they couldn't yet have. Mei Lin waited 3 hours. When Chen finally emerged, his transformation was complete. The anxious, fidgety man who had entered was now calm, peaceful, moving with the fluid grace of someone underwater. His eyes, when he passed close enough for her to see them, were glassy and distant, focused on something she could not see. That night, Mei Lin made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Instead of reporting what she had seen to Chen's family or her own, instead of calling off their engagement as social convention might have dictated, she decided to try to save him herself. The next day, she appeared at the silk shop and asked to speak with Chen privately. With trembling hands and tears in her eyes, she told him what she had seen. She begged him to explain, to help her understand what was happening to the man she had grown to love despite their arranged circumstances. Chen's reaction was not what she expected. Instead of shame or anger or denial, he seemed almost relieved. For months, he had been carrying the weight of his secret alone, watching his life slowly unravel while being unable to explain to anyone why. The relief of finally being discovered was almost as powerful as the opium itself. He told her everything, how it had started as simple curiosity and social politeness, how quickly it had grown beyond his control, how every morning he swore he would not visit the den that day, and how every evening found him there anyway, how the drug had become not just a pleasure, but a necessity, something without which the world seemed grey, harsh, and unbearably real. Most importantly, he told her how ashamed he was, not just of the addiction itself, but of his inability to break free from it. He was an educated man, from a good family, with everything to live for. How had he allowed himself to become enslaved by something so destructive? Mei Lin listened to his confession with a mixture of heartbreak and determination. She loved this man, flaws and all, and she was not going to give up on him without a fight. Together, they devised a plan. Chen would gradually reduce his visits to the den, replacing the opium with other activities. They would spend more time together, taking long walks, visiting temples, engaging in activities that might give him the peace he sought from the drug. For a few weeks, the plan seemed to work. Chen's visits to the opium den decreased from daily to every other day, then to twice a week. His eyes began to clear, his conversation became more focused, and his work at the shop improved noticeably. His family remarked on how much better he seemed, attributing the change to the positive influence of his upcoming marriage. But what neither Chen nor Mei Lin understood was that opium addiction is not simply a matter of willpower or moral failing. It is a physical dependency that rewrites the very chemistry of the brain and body. As Chen tried to stay away from the drug, his body began to rebel in ways he had never imagined possible. The first sign was the sweating. Even on cool days, Chen would find himself drenched in perspiration, his clothes clinging to his body uncomfortably. Then came the shaking, subtle tremors in his hands that made it difficult to write or handle delicate silk without dropping it. The sleeplessness was perhaps the worst part. Chen would lie in bed for hours, his mind racing with anxious thoughts, his body alternating between feeling too hot and too cold. When he finally did fall asleep, he was plagued by vivid nightmares that left him more exhausted than when he had gone to bed. During the day, everything seemed too bright, too loud, too intense. Conversations that had once been pleasant now grated on his nerves like fingernails on slate. The smell of food, once appetizing, now made him nauseous. Even Mei Lin's gentle touch, which he had always found comforting, now seemed to set his skin on fire with sensitivity. After 2 weeks of this torment, Chen could bear it no longer. Without telling Mei Lin, he returned to the opium den. The moment the smoke entered his lungs, all of his suffering vanished as if it had never existed. The relief was so profound that he wept with gratitude. But this return to the drug was different from before. Where once his usage had been controlled, measured, social, now it became desperate and consuming. He no longer smoked to enhance his life. He smoked to make life bearable at all. Chen began spending entire days at the opium den, lying on the narrow wooden bunks in rooms thick with sweet smoke, surrounded by other lost souls who had traveled the same path he now walked. These rooms, hidden away in the basements and back rooms of seemingly respectable buildings, became his world. The den he frequented was run by an elderly woman everyone called Grandmother Wu, though no one knew if she had any actual grandchildren. She had been in the opium business for over 30 years, had seen thousands of customers come and go, and had developed an almost maternal concern for her regulars, even as she enabled their destruction. Grandmother Wu's establishment was neither the most luxurious nor the most squalid of Shanghai's opium dens. The wooden bunks were clean, the pipes were well maintained, and she employed young women to prepare the opium with skill and care. The walls were decorated with faded scrolls depicting mountain landscapes and classical poetry, creating an atmosphere of refined escapism. But beneath this veneer of respectability, Grandmother Wu ran her business with the shrewd calculation of someone who understood exactly what she was selling. She knew which customers could afford the highest quality opium and which would accept inferior grades cut with other substances. She knew who needed to be extended credit and who had to pay in advance. Most importantly, she knew when a customer was nearing the end of their resources and needed to be gently but firmly encouraged to find money elsewhere. Chen became one of her most reliable customers, arriving each morning shortly after the den opened and staying until well into the evening. He had his preferred bunk, his preferred pipe, even his preferred girl to prepare his opium. The routine became as fixed as any job or family obligation had ever been. The routine at Grandmother Wu's den followed the rhythm of addiction itself. Each morning, Chen would wake in his family's house with the familiar weight of shame pressing down on his chest like a stone. His mouth would be dry, his hands trembling slightly, and his mind already calculating how quickly he could dress and make his way to the narrow alley where salvation waited. His family attributed his early rising to newfound dedication to the business, not knowing that he was fleeing toward his destruction rather than embracing responsibility. Chen would mumble excuses about meeting suppliers or checking on deliveries, then slip out into the grey Shanghai morning before anyone could ask detailed questions. The walk to Grandmother Wu's took exactly 17 minutes from his family's house. Chen had timed it obsessively, knowing that those 17 minutes represented the barrier between suffering and relief. On good days, when his body wasn't screaming for the drug, the walk felt pleasant, almost meditative. On bad days, when withdrawal clawed at his insides like a trapped animal. Those 17 minutes stretched into an eternity of mounting desperation. Grandmother Wu always greeted him with the same knowing smile, neither judgmental nor particularly warm. She treated addiction like weather, an inevitable force of nature that simply had to be accommodated. Her establishment opened at dawn and closed well past midnight, serving the needs of customers whose lives had been restructured around the availability of opium. The girl who prepared Chen's pipes was named Little Swallow, though like many who worked in the dens, this was probably not the name her parents had given her. She was perhaps 19 years old, with delicate hands that moved with the precision of a master craftsman as she heated the opium over a small flame, rolling it into perfect spheres before placing it in the pipe bowl. Little Swallow had her own story, though Chen would not learn it for many months. She had come to Shanghai from a farming village, devastated by floods, one of thousands of young women who arrived in the city with nothing but hope and determination. She had found work first as a seamstress, then as a servant in a foreign household, before finally accepting employment at Grandmother Wu's den because it paid better than any respectable work available to someone of her background. Like many who worked in the opium trade, Little Swallow had never used the drug herself. She had seen too clearly what it did to people, watched too many customers transform from vibrant individuals into hollow shells, sustained only by their need for the next pipe. This intimate knowledge of opium's effects made her both more skilled at her work and more immune to its appeal. Chen's typical day at the den began with what he had learned to call his morning medicine. Though he knew it was anything but medicinal, the first pipe of the day was always the most crucial, the one that transformed him from a shaking, anxious wreck into a functioning human being. After that first pipe, the world would settle back into focus, colours would resume their proper intensity, and the constant ache in his bones would fade to nothing. The second pipe brought euphoria, that floating sensation that had first attracted him to opium. His troubles would drift away like smoke, leaving behind only a profound sense of well-being and contentment. The third pipe would carry him into dreams, vivid fantasies where he was everything he had once hoped to become, and nothing he feared he had become. By the fourth pipe, Chen would be deep in the opium trance, lying motionless on his bunk, while his mind wandered through landscapes that existed nowhere but in his drug-altered consciousness. He would remain in this state for hours, occasionally stirring to request another pipe when the effects began to fade, then sinking back into his artificial paradise. The other regulars at Grandmother Wu's den each had their own patterns, their own relationships with the drug that had claimed their lives. There was old Master Liu, a former government official who had lost his position due to corruption charges and now spent his days reliving his former glory through opium-induced fantasies of power and respect. In the bunk next to Chen's lay young Phoenix, a woman who had once been one of Shanghai's most celebrated courtesans. Her beauty had been legendary throughout the foreign settlements, her wit and charm attracting wealthy clients from around the world. But opium had stolen her beauty as surely as time would have, leaving behind a gaunt, hollow-eyed shadow of her former self, who still spoke with the refined accent of her glory days. There was also Silent Zhang, a dock worker who had turned to opium after a loading accident left him with chronic pain that no doctor could treat. He rarely spoke to the other customers, preferring to smoke his pipes in solitude while staring at the ceiling with eyes that had seen too much suffering. His case was particularly tragic because his addiction had started as a genuine attempt to manage unbearable physical pain, only to evolve into something far more destructive than the original injury. These people became Chen's new family, bound together not by blood or affection, but by their shared enslavement to the same master. They knew each other's smoking patterns, personal preferences, and unspoken rules without ever engaging in deep conversation. The opium den was a place where privacy was respected, even in the closest quarters, where everyone understood that each person's path to addiction was their own burden to bear. As weeks turned into months, Chen's absence from his family's silk shop became impossible to ignore. His father had initially covered for him, telling customers that his son was handling important business elsewhere in the city. But as orders went unfilled and relationships with suppliers deteriorated, the truth became undeniable. Chen was no longer a functioning member of the family business or the family itself. The confrontation, when it finally came, was devastating in its quiet intensity. Chen's father did not shout or rage, which somehow made his disappointment even more crushing. Instead, he sat his son down in the shop's back room, surrounded by bolts of silk that represented generations of family work and pride, and asked simply what had happened to the boy he had raised. Chen tried to explain, but how could he make his father understand the compulsion that drove him to the den each day? How could he describe the way his body betrayed him when he tried to stay away? The way his mind convinced him that just one more pipe would be the last one? The way the drug had become more necessary to his existence than food or water or air? His father listened in silence as Chen stumbled through his confession, watching his son's hand shake and his eyes dart toward the door, as if calculating how quickly he could escape to his next fix. When Chen finished speaking, his father sat quietly for several long minutes, the weight of understanding settling over him like dust on the silk around them. The decision to send Chen away was presented as an opportunity rather than a punishment. A cousin in Beijing had offered to take Chen into his household, give him a fresh start away from the temptations of Shanghai, help him rebuild his life and his character. Chen knew it was really an exile, a way for his family to remove him from their lives without completely abandoning him. But he was too desperate to refuse any chance at redemption. But Chen's addiction was not something that could be left behind in Shanghai, like an unwanted piece of luggage. The physical dependence traveled with him, embedded in his very cells, demanding satisfaction regardless of his location or circumstances. Within days of arriving in Beijing, he was searching for new sources of opium, new dens, where he could continue feeding his habit away from his family's watchful eyes. His cousin, a successful tea merchant named Chen Ming, had agreed to take in his wayward relative as a favor to the family, not fully understanding the nature of Chen's problems. He had been told only that the young man had fallen into bad company and needed guidance and discipline to get his life back on track. Chen Ming was a stern but fair man who believed that hard work and moral instruction could cure most character defects. He put Chen to work in his tea business immediately, assigning him to inventory, customer service, and basic bookkeeping tasks that should have been well within the abilities of someone with Chen's education and background. At first, Chen threw himself into the work with desperate enthusiasm, hoping that exhaustion might help him overcome his cravings for opium. He worked from dawn until well past dark, pushing his body to its limits in an attempt to achieve the kind of peace through exhaustion that he had once found through drugs. But physical exhaustion proved no match for chemical dependence. After 3 days without opium, Chen's body began its familiar rebellion. The sweating returned, along with the shaking, the nausea, and the crushing anxiety that made every moment feel like an eternity. His work suffered as his concentration shattered and his hands became too unsteady to handle delicate tea leaves or write legible figures in the account books. Chen Ming noticed the deterioration immediately, but attributed it to laziness or lack of character rather than physical illness. He increased Chen's workload and reduced his rest periods, believing that greater discipline would solve whatever moral weakness was causing his relative's poor performance. The additional pressure only made Chen's condition worse. Desperate for relief and running out of options, he began exploring Beijing's opium establishments, searching for someone who would serve a stranger with no local connections or references. Beijing's opium trade was different from Shanghai's, more discreet and carefully hidden due to stricter government oversight in the imperial capital. The dens were smaller, more exclusive, and significantly more expensive than what Chen had been accustomed to in Shanghai. Many required introductions from existing customers or proof of ability to pay premium prices for their services. Chen's savings, already depleted by months of heavy use in Shanghai, quickly disappeared as he paid the inflated prices demanded by Beijing's opium suppliers. Within weeks, he was borrowing money from his cousin under various pretenses, claiming he needed funds for clothing, medical treatment, or investments in tea trading opportunities. Chen Ming, trusting and generous by nature, provided the requested money without question at first. But as the requests became more frequent and the amounts larger, he began to suspect that something more serious than simple financial irresponsibility was at play. The truth emerged when Chen Ming followed his cousin one evening, curious about where he spent his time after the tea shop closed. The trail led to a narrow hutong in an older part of the city, where Chen disappeared into a building that looked like a private residence but showed subtle signs of commercial activity. Chen Ming waited outside for hours, watching a steady stream of men enter and leave the building with the telltale signs he was beginning to recognize. When Chen finally emerged near midnight, stumbling slightly and moving with the dreamy, disconnected gait of the heavily intoxicated, Chen Ming understood exactly what kind of business was conducted in that innocent-looking house. The confrontation the next morning was brutal in its directness. Chen Ming had spent the night researching opium addiction, speaking with friends who had encountered the problem in their own families or businesses. He now understood that he was dealing not with a moral failing, but with a medical condition that required treatment rather than punishment. However, Chen Ming's newfound understanding came with its own complications. Treatment for opium addiction in early 20th century Beijing was primitive at best, often consisting of little more than forced confinement and gradual reduction of the drug under medical supervision. The few doctors who dealt with such cases were expensive, discreet, and not always successful in their methods. More troubling still was the social stigma attached to opium addiction in the imperial capital. While Shanghai's cosmopolitan atmosphere had created a certain tolerance for the vice, Beijing's more traditional society viewed opium use as a profound moral failure that reflected poorly on entire family lines. Discovery of Chen's condition could ruin not only his own prospects, but also damage Chen Ming's carefully built reputation in the tea trade. Chen Ming made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Rather than seek professional treatment or involve other family members, he decided to attempt a cure himself, locking Chen in a small room above the tea shop and gradually reducing his access to opium over the course of several weeks. What Chen Ming witnessed during those weeks changed his understanding of human suffering forever. Chen's withdrawal was not the simple matter of willpower, overcoming weakness that he had imagined. Instead, it was a complete breakdown of mind and body that reduced a once intelligent, capable young man to a writhing, screaming shell of his former self. The physical symptoms were bad enough. Chen's body expelled everything he tried to eat or drink, leaving him weak and dehydrated. His skin became clammy and grey, stretched tight over bones that seemed to grow more prominent each day. He developed a persistent cough that racked his entire frame, and his hands shook so violently he could barely hold a cup of water. But the mental anguish was far worse than the physical pain. Chen would spend hours begging, pleading, promising anything if Chen Ming would just allow him one small pipe to ease his suffering. He wept like a child, then raged like a madman, then fell into periods of such profound despair that Chen Ming feared he might attempt to harm himself. The nights were the worst. Chen would lie on his narrow bed, every muscle in his body cramping simultaneously, while his mind conjured up horrific visions that seemed completely real to him. He would scream about insects crawling under his skin, about demons reaching for him through the walls, about his family members appearing in the room to mock his weakness and failure. Chen Ming, sleeping on a mat outside the locked door, would listen to these episodes with growing horror and doubt. Was he helping his cousin recover, or was he torturing him needlessly? Several times, he almost gave in, almost went to find opium to end Chen's suffering, only to remind himself that temporary relief would only prolong the ultimate agony. After 2 weeks of this hell, something shifted. Chen's screaming fits became less frequent. His physical symptoms began to stabilize, and he started keeping down small amounts of rice porridge and tea. For the first time since the ordeal began, Chen Ming felt hopeful that his crude treatment might actually succeed. But recovery from opium addiction involves more than just surviving the physical withdrawal. The psychological dependence, the habits of thought and behavior that had developed around drug use, proved far more persistent than the bodily cravings. Chen emerged from his confinement physically clean but mentally fragile. Colors seemed too bright, sounds too loud, emotions too intense. Without the opium's numbing effect, he felt everything with an overwhelming immediacy that made simple daily activities feel like monumental challenges. Work at the tea shop became his anchor to normalcy, but it was a tenuous grip at best. Chen would throw himself into his tasks with manic intensity, organizing and reorganizing inventory, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean, counting and recounting money in the cash box. This frenzied activity helped distract him from the constant mental whisper that reminded him how easily all his problems could be solved with just one visit to the hutong, where relief waited. Chen Ming watched his cousin struggle with growing admiration and concern. The young man was clearly fighting a battle of enormous proportions, but the victory seemed so fragile, so dependent on perfect conditions, that any disruption might shatter his hard-won sobriety. Those disruptions came in forms both large and small. A difficult customer who reminded Chen of his failures in Shanghai would send him into hours of brooding self-recrimination. A sleepless night would leave him shaky and vulnerable the next day, his resolve weakened by exhaustion. Even pleasant experiences carried their own dangers, as Chen had learned to associate all strong emotions, positive and negative, with the need for opium to either enhance or numb them. The most dangerous moments came when Chen received letters from home. His family wrote him frequently, and their communications were carefully neutral, discussing business matters and family news without directly addressing the circumstances of his departure from Shanghai. But between the lines, Chen could read the disappointment, the worry, and the lingering hope that he might somehow redeem himself and return to the life he had abandoned. One letter brought particularly devastating news. Mei Lin, his former fiancée, had married another man. The announcement was presented as simple family news, without commentary or emotion, but Chen understood the finality it represented. The woman who had tried to save him, who had seen his potential even at his lowest point, had moved on with her life, while he remained trapped in the wreckage of his own making. That night, Chen walked to the hutong where he had once bought opium. He stood outside the familiar building for over an hour, his hands shaking not from withdrawal, but from the intensity of his desire to surrender, to escape back into the artificial peace he had known so well. The money in his pocket would buy enough opium to erase the pain of Mei Lin's marriage, to numb the shame of his exile, to restore the floating tranquility that made all problems seem distant and manageable. But as he stood there, Chen began to notice other figures in the shadows around him. Men who moved with the jerky, desperate gait of those in withdrawal, searching for their next fix. Women whose beauty had been hollowed out by years of use, their eyes reflecting a hunger that no amount of opium could truly satisfy. Children, some barely in their teens, already displaying the telltale signs of addiction as they negotiated with suppliers in whispered conversations. For the first time since his addiction began, Chen saw opium used not through the lens of his own need, but as an outside observer. These people were not choosing pleasure or escape. They were being consumed by something that had long ago stopped providing either. They were ghosts, haunting the places where they had once felt alive, forever seeking a return to a state that existed only in their memories. Chen turned away from the building and walked home through Beijing's quiet streets. The craving did not disappear, but it was joined by something else. a glimpse of understanding about what he had almost returned to and what he still had the chance to avoid becoming. His recovery was not a straight line from that moment forward. There were still days when the desire for opium felt overwhelming, still nights when sleep brought dreams of smoking and peace. But Chen had gained something precious in that moment of clarity, the ability to see his addiction from outside its influence, to understand it as a force separate from his true self. Chen Ming noticed the change immediately. His cousin began engaging more fully with customers, taking genuine interest in the different varieties of tea they sold, asking questions about suppliers and trading routes that showed real curiosity rather than mere dutiful attention. The manic quality of his work gave way to something more sustainable, more genuinely productive. Most importantly, Chen began talking about the future in concrete terms. He spoke of learning more about tea cultivation, of perhaps traveling to the mountain regions where the finest leaves were grown, of building expertise that could make him valuable to the family business in ways that went beyond simply avoiding scandal. But Chen's story was just one thread in the vast tapestry of opium addiction that colored life throughout China during this period. In the alleys and grand houses of Beijing, in the foreign concessions and traditional neighborhoods of Shanghai, in cities and towns throughout the empire, similar dramas of addiction and attempted recovery played out daily. Take the case of Madame Wang, a wealthy widow whose husband had left her a considerable fortune derived from textile manufacturing. She lived in one of Beijing's most fashionable districts, in a traditional courtyard house filled with beautiful furniture, precious artwork, and all the refinements that money could purchase. Madame Wang's introduction to opium came through her social circle, a group of wealthy women who gathered regularly for mahjong, gossip, and what they euphemistically called relaxation sessions. These women saw opium use as a mark of sophistication, a way to demonstrate their cosmopolitan attitudes and their ability to afford exotic pleasures. The sessions began as monthly indulgences, elegant affairs where the finest opium was served in delicate pipes, while the women reclined on silk cushions and discussed art, literature, and society gossip. The atmosphere was refined, almost ceremonial, far removed from the squalid dens that served the city's poorer addicts. But addiction recognizes no social boundaries, and within a year, Madame Wang found herself hosting these gatherings weekly, then twice weekly, then daily. Her beautiful home became an informal salon where Beijing's wealthy women could feed their growing dependencies in surroundings that maintained the illusion of respectability. The transformation of Madame Wang's household was gradual but inexorable. Servants who had once maintained the house with pride began to notice that their mistress cared less about dust on the furniture or proper meals served at regular hours. The elaborate gardens that had been her joy were neglected as she spent more time in the interior rooms where smoking took place. Most telling of all, Madame Wang began selling pieces of her art collection to fund increasingly expensive opium purchases. What had started as a social indulgence had become a necessity that consumed more and more of her resources, both financial and emotional. Her circle of friends changed as well. Women who could not afford to keep pace with the group's escalating drug use gradually stopped attending, replaced by newer faces who brought their own desperation and their own stories of how opium had entered and conquered their lives. Among these newer faces was Little Orchid, a young woman whose story represented another common path into addiction during this period. She had come from a respectable merchant family, but political upheavals had destroyed her father's business and scattered her relatives across the country. Alone in Beijing with few resources and fewer options, she had accepted employment as a companion to wealthy women, a position that required her to be charming, well-educated, and available for whatever activities her employers enjoyed. When Madame Wang hired Little Orchid, the young woman was grateful for steady employment that allowed her to maintain some dignity while earning enough to survive in an expensive city. She was expected to provide conversation, assist with correspondence, and accompany her employer to various social functions. Little Orchid's first exposure to opium came when Madame Wang casually offered her a pipe during one of the daily smoking sessions. The older woman presented it as a kindness, a way to help her young employee relax after a difficult day. Little Orchid, dependent on Madame Wang's goodwill for her livelihood, felt she could hardly refuse. The effect was everything Madame Wang had promised, and more. Little Orchid's constant anxiety about her uncertain future, her grief over her family's losses, her loneliness in a city where she knew few people, all of these burdens lifted away in the sweet smoke. For a few precious hours, she felt safe, content, and free from worry. But what began as an occasional indulgence quickly became a requirement of her employment. Madame Wang expected Little Orchid to join the daily smoking sessions, to help prepare pipes for guests, to assist with purchasing opium from suppliers who were becoming increasingly important to the household's daily routine. Within months, Little Orchid discovered that she could no longer function effectively without her daily doses of opium. The drug that had once provided escape from her problems had become her primary problem, a master that demanded constant attention and ever-increasing tribute. Her situation became even more complicated when she realized that Madame Wang's finances were deteriorating rapidly. The wealthy widow had sold most of her valuable possessions to fund her addiction, and her remaining resources were dwindling quickly. The household staff had been reduced to a bare minimum, and even basic maintenance of the property was being deferred to save money for opium purchases. Little Orchid found herself trapped in a household where everyone was dependent on a drug that was consuming the very resources needed to purchase it. She was too addicted to simply leave, but staying meant watching her employer's steady decline while her own dependence grew stronger each day. The crisis came when Madame Wang could no longer afford to maintain her supply of high-quality opium. The elegant smoking sessions gave way to desperate scrambles for inferior drugs cut with dangerous substances. The refined atmosphere of the household collapsed as its inhabitants focused solely on feeding their addictions by whatever means necessary. Little Orchid watched Madame Wang transform from an elegant, sophisticated woman into a hollow-eyed creature whose entire existence revolved around finding enough opium to make it through each day. The beautiful courtyard house became a tomb where the living dead went through the motions of their former lives, while their spirits slowly starved. This pattern repeated itself throughout Beijing and Shanghai, in households both grand and humble, as opium addiction spread through Chinese society like a slow-burning fire that consumed everything in its path. Each individual story was unique in its details, but shared the same tragic arc. Curiosity leading to pleasure, pleasure becoming necessity, necessity destroying everything else that had once given life meaning. The stories of Chen, Madame Wang, and Little Orchid were not exceptional in their tragedy, but rather representative of a much larger catastrophe that was reshaping Chinese society during this crucial period in the nation's history. Their individual struggles reflected the broader struggle of an entire civilization, grappling with forces beyond its immediate control or understanding. The interconnected nature of these individual tragedies becomes clearer when we consider the story of Dr. Liu Guangming, a respected physician who had studied both traditional Chinese medicine and Western medical practices. Dr. Liu maintained a clinic in Shanghai's international settlement, where he treated both Chinese and foreign patients with a combination of ancient remedies and modern techniques that had earned him considerable reputation throughout the city. Dr. Liu's path to addiction began not with recreational use, but with what he believed to be medical necessity. During a particularly harsh winter, he developed a persistent cough that refused to respond to any of his usual treatments. Traditional herbs provided no relief, and the Western medicines available through foreign suppliers proved equally ineffective. It was an elderly colleague who suggested that a small amount of opium might provide the respiratory relief that other medications had failed to deliver. The suggestion was presented purely in medical terms, with careful discussions of dosage, frequency, and duration of treatment. Dr. Liu approached the remedy with the same scientific mindset he brought to all his medical decisions. The initial results seemed to confirm the wisdom of this approach. Not only did the opium provide immediate relief for his cough, but it also eliminated the chronic fatigue and irritability that months of sleepless nights had created. Dr. Liu felt restored to his full professional capacity, able once again to provide his patients with the focused attention their conditions required. What Dr. Liu failed to anticipate was how quickly his body would adapt to the presence of opium, requiring ever-increasing amounts to achieve the same therapeutic effects. Within weeks, he found himself taking the drug not just for his cough, which had largely resolved, but for the general sense of well-being it provided. Within months, he discovered that attempting to skip his daily dose left him feeling far worse than he had ever felt during his original illness. The progression from medical use to full addiction was so gradual that Dr. Liu barely noticed it happening. He told himself that he was simply continuing a successful treatment, that his body required this medicine to function at its optimal level. When patients complimented him on his improved demeanor and renewed energy, he saw it as confirmation that his medical approach was sound. Dr. Liu's medical knowledge actually made his addiction more dangerous, rather than less so. He understood exactly how to obtain pure, high-quality opium through legitimate medical suppliers, avoiding the contaminated products that plagued street users. He knew precisely how to prepare and administer the drug for maximum effectiveness with minimum waste. Most importantly, he could maintain his addiction while appearing completely functional to his patients and colleagues. For over a year, Dr. Liu successfully balanced his professional responsibilities with his growing dependence on opium. His clinic continued to thrive. His patients remained satisfied with their treatment, and his reputation in the medical community actually grew as colleagues noted his increased confidence and apparent vitality. The balance began to shift when Dr. Liu encountered a patient whose case would change his understanding of addiction forever. Mrs. Chen, the wife of a prosperous silk merchant, came to his clinic seeking treatment for what she described as a mysterious illness that was destroying her family. Mrs. Chen's symptoms were puzzling at first glance. She complained of severe anxiety, inability to sleep, loss of appetite, and periods of intense physical discomfort that seemed to have no identifiable medical cause. More troubling still, she reported that her husband had become increasingly erratic in his behavior, disappearing for days at a time and showing little interest in his business or family responsibilities. As Dr. Liu questioned Mrs. Chen more closely about her husband's condition, a familiar pattern began to emerge. The man's absences corresponded with visits to certain establishments in the city. His mood swings followed predictable cycles, and his physical appearance had deteriorated in ways that Mrs. Chen struggled to describe, but that Dr. Liu recognized immediately. Mrs. Chen's husband was an opium addict, and she was suffering from what would later be understood as the secondary trauma that addiction inflicts on family members. Her anxiety, sleeplessness, and physical symptoms were not the result of any disease, but rather the natural response of someone watching a loved one slowly destroy himself while feeling powerless to intervene. Dr. Liu found himself in an impossible position. His medical training told him exactly what was wrong with Mr. Chen and what treatment might help both husband and wife. But his own addiction made it impossible for him to provide that treatment without confronting the reality of his own condition. Instead of addressing the underlying problem, Dr. Liu prescribed mild sedatives for Mrs. Chen's anxiety and suggested that her husband might benefit from a period of rest and relaxation. He recommended a spa in the mountains where the clean air and peaceful surroundings might restore Mr. Chen's health and vitality. Mrs. Chen followed his advice, spending the family's savings on an extended stay at an expensive retreat facility. When they returned to Shanghai several weeks later, Mr. Chen appeared temporarily improved, but within days he had resumed his old patterns with even greater intensity, as if making up for lost time. The failure of his treatment recommendations forced Dr. Liu to confront questions he had been avoiding about his own relationship with opium. Was he truly using the drug as medicine, or had he simply found a medical justification for an addiction that was no different from Mr. Chen's? Could he honestly claim to be helping patients when he was unable to recognize or treat one of the most common afflictions of their time? These questions became even more pressing when Dr. Liu began noticing how many of his patients showed subtle signs of opium use. The telltale pallor, the slightly unfocused gaze, the tendency to nod off during consultations, the requests for treatments that would complement rather than conflict with drug use. All of these signs had been present for months, but Dr. Liu had unconsciously ignored them because acknowledging them would have required acknowledging his own condition. The medical community in Shanghai existed in a state of willful blindness regarding opium addiction. Foreign doctors often dismissed it as a peculiarly Chinese weakness, while Chinese physicians like Dr. Liu found ways to rationalize their own use or that of their patients. The result was a healthcare system that was largely incapable of addressing one of the most serious public health crises of the era. Dr. Liu's personal crisis deepened when he realized that his opium use was beginning to affect his professional judgment. He had prescribed medications that were contraindicated for patients using opium, not because he didn't know better, but because his drug-altered state had impaired his ability to think clearly about complex medical interactions. More seriously, he had missed obvious symptoms in several patients because the euphoric haze of his addiction made it difficult to focus on details that might have led to early diagnosis of serious conditions. One elderly man had died from a heart condition that Dr. Liu might have detected and treated if he had been more alert during their consultations. The weight of this realization drove Dr. Liu to attempt what he had recommended to so many other patients: a period of rest and abstinence to restore his health and clarity. He closed his clinic temporarily, claiming the need for a vacation, and retreated to a small house outside the city where he intended to break free from his dependence on opium. What Dr. Liu experienced during his attempted withdrawal was far worse than anything his medical training had prepared him to handle. The physical symptoms were manageable with his knowledge of anatomy and pharmacology, but the psychological torment was beyond anything he had previously imagined possible. Without opium, Dr. Liu's enhanced confidence disappeared, replaced by crippling self-doubt about every medical decision he had ever made. His memories of failed treatments and missed diagnoses returned with overwhelming clarity, no longer softened by the drug's numbing effects. The weight of responsibility for his patients' lives, which opium had made bearable, now seemed crushing and impossible to carry. After 5 days of attempted abstinence, Dr. Liu abandoned his effort and returned to Shanghai with his addiction intact, but his self-respect shattered. He reopened his clinic and resumed treating patients, but now he carried the additional burden of knowing exactly what he was and being unable to change it. The irony of Dr. Liu's situation was that his medical knowledge made him a more dangerous addict, rather than a safer one. He could maintain his habit indefinitely without the obvious physical deterioration that marked street users, but his professional responsibilities meant that his impairment affected not just himself, but everyone who trusted him with their health. Dr. Liu's story intersected with those of other addicts throughout Shanghai in ways that created a web of mutual dependence and destruction. He treated Little Swallow, the girl who prepared pipes at Grandmother Wu's den, when she developed respiratory problems from constant exposure to opium smoke. He prescribed medications for Madame Wang when her addiction led to severe digestive problems. He even consulted on Mr. Chen's case when that man's family finally sought professional help for his condition. In each case, Dr. Liu found himself caught between his professional obligations and his personal compromises. He could diagnose opium-related health problems with perfect accuracy, but treating them effectively would have required addressing the underlying addiction, something he was psychologically incapable of doing while maintaining his own habit. The patients, for their part, often sensed that Dr. Liu understood their conditions with unusual insight and empathy. They felt comfortable discussing their opium use with him in ways they might not have with other physicians, recognizing in his manner something familiar and non-judgmental. This created a strange dynamic where Shanghai's opium addicts gravitated toward a doctor who was himself addicted, seeking treatment from someone who shared their condition, but was powerless to cure it. Dr. Liu's clinic became an unofficial gathering place for people struggling with addiction, though the struggles were rarely addressed directly. Among these patients was Master Wang, a calligrapher whose exquisite brushwork had once been sought after by scholars and officials throughout the region. Master Wang's addiction had developed slowly over many years, beginning with occasional use during periods of intense creative work and gradually becoming a daily necessity. The relationship between opium and artistic creation was complex and deeply personal for Master Wang. The drug seemed to unlock levels of creativity and technical precision that he struggled to achieve in its absence. Under its influence, his brush moved with fluid grace across silk and paper, creating characters that seemed to dance with life and meaning. But as his tolerance increased and his dependence deepened, Master Wang discovered that opium was no longer enhancing his work, but replacing it. He would spend hours in a creative trance, convinced that he was producing masterpieces, only to discover upon sobering that he had created nothing at all, or worse, that his work was crude and amateurish compared to his former standards. The decline in Master Wang's artistic abilities was gradual enough that he could deny it for months at a time. He told himself that he was simply exploring new styles, experimenting with different approaches to his craft. When clients began rejecting his work or requesting revisions, he blamed their lack of sophistication rather than his own deteriorating skills. Master Wang's visits to Dr. Liu's clinic began when he started experiencing pain in his hands and wrists, from prolonged periods of holding his brush while in an opium stupor. The drug's effects made it difficult for him to maintain proper posture or technique, leading to muscle strain and joint problems that interfered with his ability to work even during his increasingly rare sober periods. Dr. Liu recognized immediately what was happening to Master Wang's artistic abilities, having seen similar deterioration in his own medical skills. The conversation between the two men was unlike any typical doctor-patient consultation, as both understood, without speaking directly about it, that they shared a common problem that was destroying their professional lives. Instead of addressing the addiction directly, Dr. Liu prescribed exercises and treatments for Master Wang's physical symptoms, while both men maintained the fiction that the underlying cause was simply overwork or age-related decline. This dance of mutual denial allowed both to continue their habits while feeling that they were taking responsible steps to address their problems. Master Wang's family situation added another layer of complexity to his struggle with addiction. His wife had died several years earlier, leaving him to care for two young children while maintaining his calligraphy practice. The children, a boy of 12 and a girl of 9, had initially been proud of their father's artistic reputation and the respect it brought their family in their traditional neighborhood. As Master Wang's addiction progressed, his children found themselves taking on responsibilities far beyond their years. The boy, little Tiger, began managing the household finances and negotiating with clients when his father was too impaired to handle business matters. The girl, Precious Jade, took over cooking and cleaning while also attempting to continue her own education. The children's adaptation to their father's addiction was both heartbreaking and remarkable. They developed an intuitive understanding of his cycles of use and sobriety, learning to approach him with important matters during his brief periods of clarity, while protecting him from disruptions when he was in the grip of his drug-induced trances. Little Tiger showed particular skill at managing his father's business relationships, developing a mature understanding of how to maintain client satisfaction, even when Master Wang was unable to work consistently. He learned to estimate how long various projects would take based on his father's condition, to make excuses for delays without revealing their true cause, and to present finished work in ways that minimized any obvious flaws. Precious Jade's role was more focused on maintaining the household and protecting her father's health during his most vulnerable moments. She learned to recognize the signs of impending withdrawal and to prepare the simple foods that Master Wong could tolerate during those difficult periods. She also became adept at managing visits from concerned relatives and neighbors, presenting a facade of normalcy that protected the family's reputation. The children's loyalty to their father was absolute, but it came at enormous personal cost. Little Tiger's education suffered as he devoted more time to managing the household, reducing his own prospects for advancement. Precious Jade developed an anxious, hyper-vigilant personality that made it difficult for her to form normal relationships with other children her age. Both children lived in constant fear that their father's addiction would become public knowledge, bringing shame to their family and potentially leaving them without any means of support. They had heard stories of other families torn apart when a parent's opium use became known to authorities or employers, and they understood that maintaining secrecy was essential to their survival. The burden of this secrecy was perhaps the heaviest weight the children carried. They could not discuss their situation with friends, teachers, or even close relatives, leaving them isolated with their fears and responsibilities. Their childhood had been stolen not just by their father's addiction, but by the social stigma that made it impossible to seek help or support. Master Wong himself was dimly aware of what his addiction was costing his children. But the awareness came and went like shadows in his drug-altered consciousness. During his brief periods of clarity, he would be overwhelmed by guilt and resolve to change his behavior. But these moments were too infrequent and too brief to sustain any real transformation. The family's situation reached a crisis point when Master Wong's deteriorating skills led to the loss of several important commissions. Clients who had once competed for his work now began seeking other calligraphers, and the family's income dropped to levels that barely covered their basic needs, let alone Master Wong's expensive habit. Little Tiger, now 13 and bearing responsibilities that would have challenged a grown man, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Unable to watch his family sink into poverty while his father consumed their remaining resources on opium, he began stealing small amounts of money from clients and neighbors, always tiny sums that might go unnoticed, but that added up to enough to keep the household functioning. The stealing began as pure necessity, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between the family's needs and Master Wong's diminished earning capacity. But it quickly became something more complex, as Little Tiger discovered that he could also purchase lower quality opium for his father, keeping him functional enough to work while reducing the drain on their finances. This arrangement created a twisted dynamic where a 13-year-old boy was managing his father's drug supply, calculating dosages and timing to maximize productivity while minimizing cost. Little Tiger had become, in effect, his father's dealer, enabler, and business manager all in one. The psychological toll on Little Tiger was enormous. He was simultaneously trying to save his father and sustaining his father's addiction, protecting his family while engaging in criminal behavior that could destroy them all. The moral contradictions of his situation would have been difficult for an adult to navigate, let alone a child who should have been focused on his own education and development. Precious Jade watched her brother's transformation with growing alarm. She could see the weight of his responsibilities aging him prematurely, stealing away the playfulness and curiosity that should have characterized his adolescence. But she was powerless to help him, just as he was powerless to help their father. The family's story might have continued indefinitely in this tragic pattern, if not for an event that forced them to confront realities they had been avoiding. Master Wong, weakened by years of poor nutrition and drug use, collapsed while working on a commission and was found unconscious by Little Tiger when the boy returned from school. Dr. Liu was summoned to treat Master Wong, and his examination revealed the extent to which opium had ravaged the calligrapher's body. Malnutrition, dehydration, and the accumulated effects of years of drug use had left Master Wong's system severely compromised. Without immediate intervention and significant lifestyle changes, Dr. Liu warned, the man would not survive another year. The conversation between Dr. Liu and Little Tiger that followed was one of the most difficult either had ever experienced. Both understood that saving Master Wong's life would require addressing his addiction directly, but both also knew that the social and economic consequences of such action could destroy what remained of the family. Dr. Liu found himself in the impossible position of recommending treatment that he himself had been unable to accept. He knew exactly what Master Wong needed to recover, but his own continued addiction made him feel like a hypocrite for suggesting it. How could he ask a patient to undertake a course of treatment that he had proven himself incapable of completing? Little Tiger, for his part, was caught between his love for his father and his understanding of their practical circumstances. If Master Wong stopped using opium, he would be unable to work for weeks or possibly months during withdrawal and recovery. The family had no savings to sustain them during such a period, and Little Tiger's illegal activities would need to be expanded significantly to make up for the lost income. The decision they ultimately reached represented a compromise that satisfied no one, but seemed like the only viable option. Master Wong would attempt a gradual reduction in his opium use, slowly decreasing his intake while trying to maintain enough functionality to continue working. Dr. Liu would monitor his progress and provide medical support during the most difficult periods. Little Tiger would continue managing the household finances and his father's business relationships, but he would also begin seeking alternative sources of income that didn't depend on his father's artistic abilities. Precious Jade would take on even greater responsibilities for Master Wong's day-to-day care, monitoring his condition and ensuring that he maintained basic health and nutrition. The plan was implemented with careful attention to timing and dosage, but it quickly became apparent that gradual withdrawal was almost as difficult as sudden abstinence. Master Wong's reduced opium intake left him irritable, anxious, and unable to concentrate on his work for extended periods. His artistic output declined even further, while his physical symptoms made daily life increasingly uncomfortable. The children watched their father's struggle with a mixture of hope and despair. They could see that he was genuinely trying to overcome his addiction, but they could also see how much the effort was costing him and how uncertain the outcome remained. Each small victory was followed by setbacks that seemed to erase any progress that had been made. Dr. Liu's role in this process was complicated by his own relationship with opium. He found himself simultaneously encouraging Master Wong to reduce his use while increasing his own intake to cope with the stress of watching his patient suffer. The contradiction was not lost on either man, but neither felt capable of addressing it directly. As Master Wong's condition fluctuated between marginal improvement and concerning decline, other members of Shanghai's addicted community found themselves confronting their own crises. The interconnected nature of their lives meant that one person's struggle inevitably affected many others, creating ripple effects that spread throughout the network of users, suppliers, and family members who made up the opium world. Grandmother Wu, the den keeper who had served so many of these individuals, began experiencing her own challenges as political pressure on opium establishments increased. Local authorities, responding to growing international criticism of China's drug problem, had begun conducting more frequent raids and imposing heavier penalties on those caught operating illegal establishments. The raids were often announced well in advance through networks of corruption and bribery, giving operators like Grandmother Wu time to hide evidence and temporarily relocate their activities. But the increasing frequency of these disruptions made it difficult to maintain the stable, reliable service that her customers had come to expect. More troubling for Grandmother Wu was the changing nature of her clientele. The wealthy, educated users who had once formed the backbone of her business were gradually being replaced by more desperate individuals who had fewer resources and greater needs. These newer customers were less reliable in their payments, more likely to cause disturbances, and generally more difficult to manage. The shift reflected broader changes in Shanghai's opium trade, as political and social pressures made drug use less acceptable among the upper classes. Wealthy users like Madame Wang were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain their habits openly, while working-class addicts had fewer options for concealing their condition. Grandmother Wu adapted to these changes by diversifying her services and adjusting her business model to serve a broader range of customers. She began offering different grades of opium at various price points, allowing her to serve both desperate users seeking the cheapest available drugs and discriminating customers who could still afford premium products. She also expanded beyond simple opium provision to offer related services that her customers needed. These included basic medical care for addiction-related health problems, temporary housing for users who had been expelled from their homes, and even financial services for those who needed to convert valuable possessions into cash for drug purchases. This expansion made Grandmother Wu's establishment something approaching a complete support system for Shanghai's opium addicts. But it also made her operation larger, more visible, and more vulnerable to official intervention. The same services that attracted customers also attracted attention from authorities who were under pressure to demonstrate progress in combating the opium trade. Little Swallow, who had worked for Grandmother Wu for several years, found herself caught in the middle of these changing dynamics. Her role had expanded from simple pipe preparation to include customer management, inventory control, and liaison work with suppliers and authorities. The increased responsibilities came with better pay, but they also came with greater risks and moral complexities. Little Swallow had maintained her sobriety throughout her employment at the den, but the constant exposure to opium and the increasing stress of her work were beginning to wear down her resistance. She found herself tempted to try the drug she prepared so skillfully for others, particularly during the most difficult periods when customers were suffering through withdrawal or when authorities were threatening the establishment's existence. The temptation became particularly strong during the period when Master Wong was attempting his gradual withdrawal under Dr. Liu's supervision. Little Swallow had prepared pipes for Master Wong dozens of times and had developed a professional familiarity with his habits and preferences. Watching him struggle through the reduction process, while knowing exactly how much relief a single pipe could provide, created an almost unbearable tension between her professional duties and her human sympathy. Little Swallow's resistance to opium was also being undermined by the stories she heard daily from the den's customers. These were not cautionary tales about the dangers of addiction, but rather intimate accounts of the peace, creativity, and escape that the drug had provided before tolerance and dependence had complicated the relationship. Master Wong, during his more lucid moments, would describe to Little Swallow how opium had once enhanced his calligraphy, allowing him to achieve levels of artistic expression that seemed impossible in its absence. Dr. Liu spoke of how the drug had initially improved his medical practice by reducing anxiety and increasing confidence in his diagnostic abilities. Even Chen, during his visits to the den before his exile to Beijing, had shared stories of how opium had provided relief from family pressures and social expectations that had felt overwhelming in his normal state. These accounts, coming from educated, accomplished individuals, made opium use seem less like a moral failing and more like a reasonable response to life's challenges. Little Swallow began to wonder if her abstinence was really a virtue or simply a failure to understand what she was missing. The customers she served seemed to find genuine value in their opium use, even as it caused obvious problems in their lives. Perhaps the key was moderation, careful use that could provide benefits without leading to the kind of dependence that had destroyed so many lives. This rationalization process, which addiction specialists would later recognize as a common precursor to initial drug use, was encouraged by the environment in which Little Swallow worked. Surrounded daily by people who had found temporary solutions to their problems through opium, she was naturally inclined to see the drug as potentially beneficial rather than inevitably destructive. The decision to try opium for herself came during a particularly stressful period when multiple customers were experiencing withdrawal simultaneously, while authorities were conducting more frequent inspections of the establishment. Little Swallow had been working 18-hour days, managing crises while maintaining the appearance of normalcy, and she found herself exhausted beyond anything she had previously experienced. One evening, after Grandmother Wu had closed the establishment and dismissed the other workers, Little Swallow remained behind to clean and prepare for the next day's business. The building was quiet, the pipes were clean and ready, and high-quality opium remained available from the day's supplies. Little Swallow prepared a pipe for herself with the same skill she had developed serving others, taking care to use a moderate amount of the finest opium available. Her first experience with the drug was everything the customers had described and more. The exhaustion that had been weighing her down for weeks simply disappeared, replaced by a sense of profound well-being and clarity. For the first time in months, Little Swallow felt truly relaxed. The constant worry about authorities, customers, and her own uncertain future faded into insignificance. She found herself appreciating the beauty of the den's decorations, the craftsmanship of the pipes, and the elegant ritual of opium preparation in ways she had never noticed during her years of work. Most importantly, Little Swallow experienced a sense of connection to the customers she served that had been missing from her previous understanding. She finally comprehended why educated, successful people would risk everything for this experience, why they would return day after day despite obvious negative consequences. The insight felt profound and valuable, a deepening of her professional knowledge that would make her more effective in her work. Little Swallow convinced herself that her opium use was actually a form of professional development, a way to better understand and serve the people who depended on her skills. This initial rationalization allowed Little Swallow to incorporate occasional opium use into her routine without seeing it as a fundamental change in her character or circumstances. She used the drug only after work, only in small amounts, and only when stress or exhaustion seemed to justify the indulgence. For several weeks, this pattern seemed sustainable. Little Swallow's work performance remained high, her relationships with customers and colleagues stayed positive, and her personal life continued much as it had before. She told herself that she had found the perfect balance, enjoying the benefits of opium while avoiding the pitfalls that had trapped so many others. But the nature of opium addiction is such that the user's perception of control is often the first casualty of regular use. Little Swallow's occasional evening indulgences gradually became more frequent as her tolerance developed and her rationalization system expanded to accommodate increasing use. Within 2 months, Little Swallow was using opium every evening after work. Within 4 months, she had begun taking small amounts during her lunch breaks to help manage the stress of difficult customers and demanding workdays. Within 6 months, she required a morning dose simply to function normally throughout the day. The progression followed the same pattern that Little Swallow had observed in hundreds of customers. But her intimate familiarity with the process did not protect her from experiencing it herself. If anything, her professional knowledge made her addiction more dangerous because she understood exactly how to maintain her habit efficiently and discreetly. Little Swallow's transformation was noticed by Grandmother Wu, who had seen too many employees follow the same path to be surprised by another instance. The older woman faced a difficult decision about how to handle the situation. Little Swallow was one of her most skilled and reliable workers, someone whose loss would significantly impact the operation's effectiveness. At the same time, Grandmother Wu understood that employees who became addicted to the product they handled rarely remained effective for long. The progression from occasional use to complete dependence was predictable, and it typically ended with the worker becoming just another customer rather than a productive member of the business. Grandmother Wu's solution was characteristically practical. Instead of dismissing Little Swallow or attempting to force her into sobriety, she adjusted the young woman's responsibilities and compensation to account for her new status as both employee and customer. Little Swallow would continue her pipe preparation duties, but part of her wages would be paid in opium rather than cash. This arrangement solved several problems simultaneously. Little Swallow could maintain her habit without stealing from inventory or compromising the business financially. Grandmother Wu retained her most skilled employee while reducing labor costs. The establishment gained another regular customer whose consumption was already accounted for in the business model. But the arrangement also created new complications. Little Swallow's status as both worker and customer blurred the boundaries that had previously governed relationships within the den. Other customers began approaching her for special favors or preferential treatment, while other employees viewed her with suspicion and resentment. More problematically, Little Swallow's dual role made it difficult for her to maintain the emotional distance that had previously protected her from the full impact of witnessing daily human suffering. As a sober employee, she'd been able to help customers while remaining somewhat detached from their personal tragedies. As a fellow addict, she found herself emotionally invested in their struggles in ways that made her work much more psychologically demanding. The change was particularly evident in her interactions with customers like Master Wong during his attempted withdrawal. Previously, Little Swallow had been able to prepare his reduced doses with professional detachment, focusing on technical precision rather than emotional involvement. Now, watching him suffer through the reduction process, while knowing exactly how much relief she could provide, created almost unbearable internal conflict. Little Swallow found herself caught between her professional obligations to follow Dr. Lu's treatment plan and her personal understanding of how much Master Wong was suffering unnecessarily. The knowledge that a single full-strength pipe could eliminate his immediate distress while she was required to provide only measured, insufficient amounts felt like a form of torture. This emotional burden was compounded by Little Swallow's own increasing dependence on opium. As her tolerance grew and her doses increased, she began experiencing her own withdrawal symptoms during the periods between uses. The physical discomfort and emotional instability that characterized these episodes made it even more difficult for her to watch others endure similar suffering. Little Swallow's personal crisis came to a head during a period when authorities conducted an unexpected raid on Grandmother Wu's establishment. The raid occurred during peak hours when the building was filled with customers in various states of intoxication, making it impossible to hide the nature of the business being conducted. Grandmother Wu had prepared for such eventualities by maintaining relationships with local officials who usually provided advance warning of planned raids. But this operation had been organized by higher-level authorities who bypassed the usual corruption networks, catching everyone involved completely unprepared. Little Swallow, who had been preparing pipes when the authorities arrived, was arrested along with Grandmother Wu, several other employees, and dozens of customers. The charges included operating an illegal establishment, possession of controlled substances, and contributing to public vice. The arrest was traumatic not just because of the legal consequences, but because it forced Little Swallow to confront the reality of her situation in ways she had been avoiding. Sitting in a crowded jail cell with other arrestees, many of whom were experiencing various stages of withdrawal, she could no longer maintain the illusion that her opium use was somehow different or more controlled than theirs. The physical withdrawal began within hours of her arrest. The familiar warmth and comfort that opium provided was replaced by a creeping anxiety that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Her hands began to shake, subtly at first, then with increasing violence as the hours passed. Sleep became impossible as her body alternated between fevered sweating and bone-deep chills. But the psychological withdrawal was even more devastating than the physical symptoms. Without opium to soften the edges of reality, Little Swallow was forced to confront the full weight of what her life had become. She was a criminal, caught in the act of facilitating addiction for others while being consumed by her own dependence. The professional pride she had taken in her skills now seemed like nothing more than elaborate self-deception. The other women in the cell represented a cross-section of Shanghai's opium-affected population. There was a courtesan whose beauty had been legendary just 5 years earlier, but who now looked decades older than her actual age. A merchant's wife sat quietly in the corner, her fine clothes contrasting sharply with the hollow desperation in her eyes. Several working-class women huddled together, their withdrawal symptoms more advanced because they had been using inferior quality opium that left their systems more quickly. Among these women was someone Little Swallow recognized but had never expected to encounter in such circumstances. Mei Lin, Chen's former fiancée, sat against the far wall with her head in her hands, her body racked with the unmistakable tremors of opium withdrawal. The sight of Mei Lin shocked Little Swallow more than anything else about her arrest. This was the woman she had heard about from Chen during his visits to the den, the respectable merchant's daughter who had tried to save her betrothed from his addiction. What series of events had led her to this same cell, suffering from the same affliction that had destroyed the man she had once tried to rescue? During the long hours of that first night in custody, as withdrawal symptoms made sleep impossible for most of the women, Mei Lin began to speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet desperation of the cell, everyone listened to her story. After Chen had been sent away to Beijing, Mei Lin had been devastated by the failure of her attempts to save him. She blamed herself for not understanding the true nature of his addiction, for not being strong enough or clever enough to find a way to help him break free. The arranged marriage that had been cancelled due to Chen's condition left her in a difficult social position, neither married nor completely free to make her own choices. Mei Lin's family had been understanding at first, attributing her melancholy to the natural disappointment of a broken engagement. They encouraged her to focus on other suitors, other possibilities for marriage that might restore her social standing and provide security for her future. But Mei Lin found herself unable to engage with these prospects, haunted by memories of Chen and consumed by guilt over her perceived failures. It was during this period of grief and self-recrimination that Mei Lin first encountered opium. A friend of her family, an older woman who had noticed her distress, suggested that a small amount of the drug might help her sleep better and ease the emotional pain that seemed to be consuming her. The suggestion was made with genuine kindness, presented as a temporary measure to help Mei Lin through a difficult period in her life. The woman had used opium herself to cope with the death of her husband several years earlier, and spoke of it as a valuable tool for managing overwhelming emotions. Mei Lin's first experience with opium was everything her friend had promised. The crushing weight of her guilt and sadness simply lifted away, replaced by a peaceful acceptance of her circumstances. For the first time in months, she was able to think about Chen without being overwhelmed by regret, to consider her own future without being paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The relief was so profound that Mei Lin convinced herself she had found a genuine solution to her problems. The opium wasn't making her forget her troubles. It was allowing her to process them rationally, without the emotional intensity that had been preventing her from moving forward with her life. This rationalization allowed Mei Lin to incorporate opium use into her daily routine without seeing it as a fundamental change in her character. She used the drug to manage specific situations that might otherwise overwhelm her. Family gatherings where her unmarried status was discussed, encounters with mutual friends of her and Chen, moments when memories of her failed engagement became too painful to bear. For several months, this pattern seemed sustainable. Mei Lin's family noticed an improvement in her mood and began to hope that she was recovering from her disappointment. She began engaging more actively in social activities, showing interest in potential suitors, and generally behaving like the dutiful daughter they had always known. But beneath this surface improvement, Mei Lin was developing the same dependence that had claimed so many others. Her occasional use of opium to manage difficult emotions gradually became a daily necessity as her natural ability to cope with stress and sadness diminished. The progression was so gradual that Mei Lin barely noticed it happening. She told herself that she was simply being proactive about her emotional health, using a tool that allowed her to function more effectively in social situations. When family members complimented her on her improved spirits, she saw it as confirmation that her approach was working. The reality was that Mei Lin was slowly losing her ability to experience genuine emotions without chemical assistance. Joy, sadness, anger, and fear all became muted and manageable under the influence of opium, but they also became less authentic, less connected to her real circumstances and relationships. This emotional numbing had serious consequences for Mei Lin's ability to form new relationships. Several suitable men had shown interest in marrying her, but she found herself unable to generate genuine feelings about any of them. Under the influence of opium, all potential partners seemed equally acceptable or unacceptable, their individual qualities obscured by the drug's leveling effect on her emotional responses. Mei Lin's family began to worry about her apparent indifference to marriage prospects that should have been exciting opportunities. They attributed her lack of enthusiasm to lingering feelings for Chen, not understanding that opium had made it impossible for her to form strong emotional attachments to anyone or anything. The situation became more complicated when Mei Lin's opium use began affecting her ability to manage household responsibilities and social obligations. She would forget important appointments, lose track of conversations mid-sentence, and display the kind of dreamy inattention that her family found increasingly concerning. These behavioral changes coincided with financial pressures as Mei Lin's opium use became more expensive. She began selling personal possessions to fund her habit, starting with jewelry and clothing that she told her family she had outgrown or no longer needed. The sales escalated as Mei Lin's tolerance increased and her need for higher quality opium grew. She sold books, artwork, and family heirlooms, always with plausible explanations about wanting to simplify her possessions or contribute to family finances. Mei Lin's descent into full addiction accelerated when she discovered that her family friend who had introduced her to opium was also struggling with increasingly severe dependence. The older woman had lost most of her wealth feeding her habit and was now frequenting establishments like Grandmother Wu's den, rather than obtaining opium through more expensive private suppliers. Following her friend's example, Mei Lin began visiting opium dens in Shanghai's less respectable districts. The transition from private, genteel opium use to public consumption in commercial establishments represented a crucial psychological shift that Mei Lin barely recognized at the time. The dens offered several advantages over private use. The opium was generally higher quality and more potent than what individual users could obtain through informal networks. The preparation was handled by skilled professionals who could maximize the drug's effects. Most importantly, the dens provided a social environment where opium use was normalized and accepted. But the dens also exposed Mei Lin to a different class of users, people whose addictions were more advanced and whose life circumstances were more desperate than her own. She began to understand that opium addiction was not simply a problem of individual willpower or moral weakness, but a condition that could affect anyone regardless of education, social status, or initial intentions. This understanding was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it reduced the shame and self-blame that had been part of Mei Lin's experience with addiction. Terrifying because it suggested that her own descent into dependence might be inevitable, regardless of her efforts to maintain control. Mei Lin's arrest had occurred during one of her regular visits to Grandmother Wu's establishment. She had been there for several hours, having consumed more opium than usual in an attempt to cope with a family crisis that had erupted earlier that day. Her younger sister had become engaged to a wealthy merchant's son, an event that should have been cause for celebration, but that had instead highlighted Mei Lin's own unmarried status and uncertain prospects. The engagement party had been a torture of well-meaning relatives, asking when Mei Lin might find her own happiness, combined with subtle suggestions that her standards might be too high or her attitude insufficiently welcoming to potential suitors. Unable to bear the combination of social pressure and personal regret, Mei Lin had excused herself from the celebration and made her way to the den where she hoped to find the emotional numbness that would allow her to return home and participate in her sister's happiness without being overwhelmed by her own sense of failure. The irony was that Mei Lin's arrest occurred just as she was beginning to recognize the full extent of her addiction and consider seeking help. The shock of being caught in a police raid, of being treated as a criminal rather than a victim, of finding herself in a jail cell with other women whose stories mirrored her own, forced her to confront reality she had been avoiding for months. Sitting in that cell, listening to other women share their experiences, Mei Lin began to understand that her addiction was not a unique personal failing, but part of a much larger tragedy that was affecting thousands of families throughout Shanghai and beyond. One of the older women in the cell, a former opera singer whose voice had been destroyed by years of opium use, spoke about the children she had seen begging in the streets because their parents had sold everything to feed their addictions. Another woman, a seamstress who had lost her shop when she could no longer concentrate enough to do quality work, described watching her elderly mother try to care for grandchildren whose parents had disappeared into the opium underworld. These stories helped Mei Lin understand that her own suffering was connected to a vast network of pain and destruction that reached into every level of Chinese society. The opium that provided temporary relief from individual problems was simultaneously creating much larger problems that affected entire communities. Little Swallow, listening to these conversations while dealing with her own withdrawal symptoms, began to see her role at Grandmother Wu's den in a completely different light. She had told herself that she was providing a service, helping people manage their pain and find moments of peace in difficult lives. Now she understood that she had been participating in a system that created far more suffering than it alleviated. The women in the cell represented just a tiny fraction of the people whose lives had been damaged by Shanghai's opium trade. For every person arrested in the raid, dozens of others remained free but trapped in various stages of addiction. For every user, there were family members, friends, and community members whose lives were also affected by the consequences of addiction. The scope of the problem became even clearer as the women shared information about their families and neighborhoods. Almost everyone had relatives or close friends who were also struggling with opium dependence. Many had children whose futures were being compromised by their parents' addiction. Some had spouses who had died from overdoses or suicide related to their inability to break free from drugs. The interconnected nature of these stories revealed that opium addiction in Shanghai was not simply a collection of individual problems, but a social epidemic that was reshaping the entire fabric of community life. Traditional family structures were breaking down as addiction disrupted normal patterns of work, child-rearing, and social responsibility. Economic relationships were also being distorted as more and more resources were diverted from productive activities to drug consumption. Businesses failed when key employees became unreliable due to addiction. Families lost their savings and property to feed habits that provided no lasting benefit to anyone. Even cultural and artistic traditions were being affected as creative individuals, like Master Wong, found their abilities compromised by drug use. The very elements of Chinese civilization that had developed over centuries were being undermined by a substance that promised enhancement but delivered destruction. The women's conversations in the jail cell continued through the night as withdrawal symptoms made sleep impossible for most of them. They shared not only their personal stories but also practical information about treatment options, family resources, and strategies for recovery that some had tried with varying degrees of success. Several women spoke about relatives who had managed to overcome their addictions, though the stories were mixed in their outcomes. Some had succeeded through religious conversion, finding in spiritual practice the sense of purpose and community that had been missing from their lives. Others had recovered through geographic relocation, leaving Shanghai entirely to start fresh in places where opium was less available and social pressures were different. A few had found help through traditional Chinese medicine practitioners who specialized in treating addiction, using combinations of herbs, acupuncture, and counseling to address both the physical and psychological aspects of dependence. These treatments were expensive and not always effective, but they offered hope for those who could afford them and were willing to commit to lengthy recovery processes. The most successful recoveries seemed to involve combinations of medical treatment, family support, and fundamental changes in lifestyle. that removed addicted individuals from environments where drug use was normalized. But even these success stories came with warnings about the difficulty of maintaining sobriety and the constant vigilance required to prevent relapse. Little Swallow absorbed these conversations with growing determination to change her own circumstances. Her arrest had been a shock that stripped away the illusions she had maintained about her situation. But it had also provided her with information and inspiration that might make recovery possible. She began to formulate a plan that would require her to leave Shanghai entirely, abandoning the life she had built around the opium trade and starting over in a place where she could develop new skills and relationships. The plan was risky and would require resources she didn't currently possess, but it seemed like the only way to break free from the cycle of addiction that had trapped her. Mei Lin was developing similar thoughts about the need for dramatic change in her life. Her arrest had made it impossible to continue hiding her addiction from her family, and she knew that the shame and scandal would make it difficult for her to remain in Shanghai, even if she managed to achieve sobriety. The two women began to discuss the possibility of leaving the city together, pooling their limited resources and providing mutual support during the difficult process of withdrawal and recovery. Neither had family connections in other parts of China, but they had heard about communities where former addicts had successfully rebuilt their lives with the help of religious organizations or charitable institutions. Their planning was interrupted when authorities began processing the arrestees for release or transfer to other facilities. The legal system's handling of opium-related crimes was inconsistent and often corrupt, with outcomes depending more on an individual's family connections and ability to pay bribes than on the specific charges or circumstances involved. Grandmother Wu, despite being the primary target of the raid, was released within hours after payments were made to appropriate officials. Her establishment would remain closed for a decent interval to satisfy public demands for action against the opium trade. But everyone involved understood that operations would resume under different management or in a different location once attention had moved elsewhere. Little Swallow and Mei Lin were among the last to be processed, partly because neither had family members working actively to secure their release, and partly because their cases were complicated by questions about their roles in the establishment's operations. Little Swallow's status as an employee made her potentially liable for more serious charges, while Mei Lin's social background made officials reluctant to treat her as a common criminal without careful consideration of the political implications. The delay actually worked in their favor, as it provided additional time for withdrawal symptoms to run their course, and for both women to develop clearer thinking about their situations and options. By the time they were finally released, both had committed to leaving Shanghai and attempting recovery in a different environment. The plan they developed was simple but ambitious. They would travel to a small city in Jiangsu province where Mei Lin had distant relatives who might provide temporary shelter and assistance. Neither woman had visited this location before, but its distance from Shanghai and its smaller size suggested that opium would be less readily available and that they might be able to build new identities free from their past associations with drugs. The journey would require most of their remaining resources, leaving them with very little money for establishing new lives once they arrived at their destination. But both women understood that staying in Shanghai would almost certainly result in relapse and continued degradation, making even the most uncertain alternative preferable to their current circumstances. Their departure from Shanghai took place on a grey morning in early spring, when the city was shrouded in mist that seemed to symbolize the uncertain nature of their future. Neither woman looked back as their boat moved away from the dock, but both carried with them memories of the people and places that had shaped their experiences with addiction. Little Swallow thought about Grandmother Wu and the other workers at the den, wondering if any of them would find the courage to change their own circumstances, or if they would continue serving the needs of Shanghai's addicted population until age or illness forced them into different roles. Mei Lin's thoughts turned to her family and the pain her addiction and arrest had caused them. She hoped that her departure would allow them to heal from the shame and worry she had brought into their lives, and that her sister's marriage would not be overshadowed by scandal. Both women also thought about the customers they had known at the den. People like Master Wong and Dr. Liu, whose struggles with addiction were ongoing and whose outcomes remained uncertain. They understood that their own attempt at recovery was just one small part of a much larger tragedy that would continue to unfold, regardless of their personal success or failure. The boat journey provided time for reflection and planning, but it also brought the first serious test of their commitment to sobriety. Both women experienced renewed withdrawal symptoms triggered by stress and the physical discomfort of travel, and both found themselves fantasizing about the relief that opium could provide. The temptation was particularly strong when they stopped at river towns, where opium was clearly available, and where their distress might have been easily remedied with small purchases from local suppliers. But their mutual support and shared commitment to change helped them resist these impulses and continue toward their destination. Their arrival in Jiangsu marked the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives, though the outcome of their recovery attempt would not be determined for months or years to come. They had escaped Shanghai and broken the immediate patterns of their addiction, but the deeper work of rebuilding their lives and identities as sober individuals still lay ahead. Meanwhile, back in Shanghai, the stories of other addicts continue to unfold in patterns both tragic and hopeful. Master Wong's attempted withdrawal under Dr. Liu's supervision had reached a critical point where both men had to decide whether to continue the gradual reduction process or abandon it in favor of either complete abstinence or a return to full addiction. Dr. Liu himself was facing his own crisis as the stress of treating Master Wong while maintaining his own habit became increasingly unsustainable. The contradictions in his position were becoming impossible to ignore, and he found himself considering options he had never seriously contemplated before. Chen's story in Beijing was also reaching a turning point, as his cousin Chen Ming struggled with the realization that his amateur attempts at treatment were inadequate for addressing the complexity of opium addiction. The two men would soon have to make decisions about seeking professional help, accepting the current situation, or pursuing more drastic alternatives. These individual stories, playing out across the vast landscape of early 20th century China, represented just a small fraction of the human cost of the opium trade. Each person struggling with addiction carried with them the hopes and fears of families, the economic potential of communities, and the cultural heritage of a civilization that was being reshaped by forces beyond anyone's immediate control. The tragedy was not simply that so many individuals were suffering, but that their suffering was interconnected in ways that made recovery difficult for anyone to achieve alone. The social, economic, and cultural systems that had once provided support and meaning for people's lives had been disrupted by the widespread availability of a substance that promised to solve problems, but ultimately created far more difficulties than it resolved. Yet within this larger tragedy, there were also stories of resilience, determination, and hope. People like Little Swallow and Mei Lin, who found the courage to abandon familiar patterns and risk everything for the possibility of a different kind of life. Families like Chen Ming's who continued to provide support, even when they didn't fully understand the nature of the problems they were trying to address. Medical professionals who began to recognize addiction as a treatable condition rather than a moral failing, and who worked to develop more effective approaches to helping people recover. Community leaders who started to understand that addressing the opium crisis would require coordinated social action rather than individual moral reformation. The stories of these individuals would continue to unfold, their outcomes uncertain, but their courage undeniable. In their struggles to break free from addiction and rebuild their lives, they were writing new chapters in the long history of human resilience in the face of seemingly overwhelming challenges. Their experiences would become part of the larger story of how Chinese society eventually began to address the opium crisis, learning through trial and error what approaches were most effective in helping people recover, and what changes in law, medicine, and social policy were needed to prevent future generations from facing the same struggles. But that larger story would take decades to unfold, and its ultimate resolution would require the efforts of thousands of individuals who chose, like Little Swallow and Mei Lin, to risk the familiar pain of addiction for the uncertain possibility of a life lived free from chemical dependence. The interconnected web of addiction that stretched across Shanghai during this period created strange alliances and unlikely friendships between people who might never have met under different circumstances. In the cramped quarters of opium dens, social hierarchies dissolved as shared dependence created bonds stronger than class or education could break. This was how Professor Zhang Weimin, a respected scholar of classical literature at one of Shanghai's most prestigious academies, came to know Rickshaw Liu, a street puller whose calloused hands told the story of 20 years spent navigating the city's chaotic streets. Their friendship began in silence, lying on adjacent bunks at Mother Chen's establishment, a smaller den that catered to customers who valued discretion over luxury. Professor Zhang had discovered opium during a period of intense academic pressure. The academy where he taught was undergoing modernization, incorporating Western educational methods alongside traditional Chinese learning. As one of the few faculty members fluent in both approaches, Zhang found himself overwhelmed by the demands of curriculum development, student instruction, and the political maneuvering required to maintain his position during uncertain times. His first encounter with the drug came through a colleague who suggested it might help with the chronic headaches that had begun plaguing Zhang during his most stressful periods. The colleague, an older professor of mathematics, spoke of opium as scholars once discussed wine, as a tool for achieving the kind of mental clarity that enhanced, rather than impaired, intellectual work. Zhang approached opium with the same methodical curiosity he brought to his academic research. He began with careful notes about dosage, timing, and effects, treating his drug use as a personal experiment in consciousness and productivity. The initial results seemed to confirm his colleague's claims. Under the influence of opium, Zhang found that his mind could focus with laser intensity on complex textual analysis while simultaneously maintaining awareness of broader thematic connections that usually escaped his attention. His lectures improved dramatically during this period. Students who had previously found his presentations dry and overly detailed now praised his ability to make ancient texts seem immediately relevant and emotionally compelling. Zhang attributed this transformation to his enhanced understanding of the emotional depths contained within classical poetry and philosophy, insights that opium seemed to unlock with remarkable consistency. For nearly a year, Zhang maintained what he considered a successful balance between his academic responsibilities and his carefully controlled drug use. He smoked only in the evenings after completing his daily work, never during school hours or in circumstances where his altered state might be detected by colleagues or administrators. But tolerance, that universal enemy of controlled drug use, began to erode Zhang's carefully constructed system. The amount of opium required to achieve his desired level of mental enhancement gradually increased, while the duration of its effects steadily decreased. Zhang found himself needing to smoke earlier in the day to maintain his teaching performance, and later in the evening to achieve the peaceful sleep that had become impossible without chemical assistance. The transition from evening use to daytime consumption marked a crucial psychological shift for Zhang. No longer was he using opium to enhance his natural abilities. He was using it to compensate for diminished capabilities that seemed to emerge whenever the drug was absent from his system. His unmedicated mind now felt sluggish, anxious, and incapable of the intellectual feats that had once come naturally. Zhang's academic work began to suffer as his addiction progressed. Papers that should have taken weeks to complete stretched into months-long projects as his concentration wavered between periods of drug-enhanced hyperfocus and withdrawal-induced mental fog. His interactions with students became unpredictable, alternating between moments of brilliant insight and episodes of confused rambling that left everyone involved uncertain about what had just occurred. The breaking point came during a faculty meeting, where Zhang was expected to present his research on Tang Dynasty poetry. He had prepared extensively for the presentation, but on the morning of the meeting, his usual opium supplier was unavailable due to a family emergency. Unable to obtain his customary dose, Zhang attempted to deliver his presentation while experiencing the early stages of withdrawal. The result was catastrophic. Zhang's hands shook so violently that he could barely hold his notes, while his voice cracked with anxiety as he struggled to remember points that had seemed crystal clear just days before. His arguments became circular and confused, and he lost his train of thought multiple times during the 40-minute presentation. The faculty's response was a mixture of concern and embarrassment. Zhang's colleagues attributed his poor performance to overwork and stress. Recommendations were made for him to take a leave of absence to restore his health. The suggestion was presented as a kindness, but Zhang understood that it was actually a gentle form of professional exile, designed to protect both his reputation and the academy's. The forced break from teaching removed the last external structure that had been holding Zhang's life together. Without the daily responsibilities of classes and research, he found himself with unlimited time to spend at Mother Chen's den, where his academic credentials earned him a respect that his deteriorating appearance no longer commanded in professional settings. It was during his extended stays at the den that Zhang encountered Rickshaw Liu, a man whose life experiences could not have been more different from his own. Liu had been pulling rickshaws through Shanghai's streets since he was 16 years old, supporting a wife and 3 children through work that demanded physical strength, street wisdom, and an intimate knowledge of the city's geography and social dynamics. Liu's introduction to opium had come through injury rather than curiosity or academic pressure. A collision with a horse-drawn cart had left him with chronic pain in his back and left leg that made his physically demanding work almost unbearable. Traditional remedies had provided minimal relief, and Western doctors were both expensive and largely unfamiliar with the specific injuries common to rickshaw pullers. A fellow puller had suggested that opium might provide the pain relief that other treatments had failed to deliver. The suggestion made practical sense to Liu, who had observed that many of his colleagues used the drug to manage the physical demands of their profession. If opium could reduce his pain enough to allow him to continue working, it would pay for itself through increased earning capacity. Liu's early experiences with opium seemed to confirm this practical calculation. The drug not only reduced his physical discomfort, but also gave him a sense of energy and endurance that made long days of pulling increasingly heavy loads feel manageable rather than torturous. His income actually increased during the first months of his use as he was able to work longer hours and accept more challenging routes through the city. But what had begun as pain management gradually evolved into something more complex. Liu discovered that opium didn't just relieve his physical suffering, it also provided escape from the psychological burdens of his life circumstances. The constant worry about feeding his family, the humiliation of being treated as little more than a beast of burden by wealthy passengers, the recognition that his children would likely inherit his poverty and limited opportunities. All of these concerns faded into insignificance under the influence of the drug. This psychological relief became as important to Liu as the physical benefits, perhaps more so. After particularly difficult days dealing with demanding customers or navigating dangerous traffic conditions, Liu found that opium provided a sense of peace and dignity that was otherwise absent from his life. Under its influence, he felt like a complete human being, rather than simply a pair of strong legs and steady hands. The progression from therapeutic use to full addiction followed a pattern that was becoming tragically familiar throughout Shanghai's working population. As Liu's tolerance increased, he needed more opium to achieve the same level of pain relief and psychological comfort. As his drug expenses grew, he was forced to work longer hours to maintain his habit, which increased his physical pain and psychological stress, which in turn increased his need for chemical relief. Liu's family began to notice changes in his behavior and priorities. Money that had once gone toward better food, children's education, and household improvements was now being diverted to drug purchases. Liu became secretive about his activities and whereabouts, often disappearing for hours after completing his work, rather than returning home immediately as he had always done before. His wife, Mai Feng, suspected that another woman might be involved in her husband's strange behavior. The alternative explanation, that Liu was using drugs, seemed impossible given his strong character and his devotion to their family's welfare. Mai Feng had heard stories about opium addiction, but they always involved wealthy idlers or weak-willed individuals who lacked Liu's strength and sense of responsibility. The truth emerged when Liu collapsed while pulling his rickshaw through one of Shanghai's busiest commercial districts. The collapse occurred during the peak of afternoon traffic, creating a dangerous situation as other vehicles swerved to avoid the suddenly stationary rickshaw and its unconscious puller. Liu was taken to a nearby clinic where the attending physician immediately recognized the symptoms of opium withdrawal. The doctor's diagnosis was delivered to Mai Feng with a mixture of medical detachment and social judgment that left her feeling both devastated and ashamed. The revelation that her husband was addicted to opium forced Mai Feng to reevaluate everything she thought she understood about their life together. The financial pressures she had attributed to difficult economic conditions were actually the result of Liu's drug expenses. His occasional moodiness and distraction, which she had blamed on work stress, were symptoms of withdrawal and intoxication cycles. Most painful of all was the recognition that Liu had been suffering alone with his addiction, unable or unwilling to share his struggles with the woman who had pledged to support him through any difficulty life might bring. Mai Feng felt that she had failed as a wife, either by not recognizing her husband's problem or by creating conditions that made him feel unable to ask for her help. Liu's recovery from the collapse was complicated by the fact that his physical dependence on opium made it dangerous to stop using the drug suddenly. The clinic's doctor recommended a gradual reduction program that would allow Liu's body to adjust slowly to decreased opium levels. But such treatment required time and resources that the family did not possess. Liu needed to return to work immediately to support his family and pay for his medical care. But his withdrawal symptoms made it difficult for him to perform the physical labor that rickshaw pulling demanded. His hands shook too severely to maintain a steady grip on the rickshaw handles, while his legs felt weak and unsteady during the long hours of walking and running required by his profession. The practical solution that Liu and Mai Feng developed was a compromise that satisfied no one, but seemed like the only viable option under their circumstances. Liu would continue using opium in carefully measured amounts that would prevent severe withdrawal while gradually reducing his overall consumption. Mai Feng would take on additional work as a seamstress to help cover the family's expenses during Liu's recovery period. This arrangement brought Liu to Mother Chen's establishment, where measured doses of reliable opium could be obtained without the social complications of the more upscale dens that served wealthy customers. The smaller den's atmosphere was more utilitarian than luxurious, focused on providing consistent service to working people who needed to maintain their drug habits while continuing to meet their responsibilities. It was in this environment that Liu met Professor Zhang, and despite their vastly different backgrounds, the two men discovered that they shared important common ground in their struggles with addiction. Both had initially used opium for practical reasons related to their work. Both had found their lives gradually reshaped by their dependence on the drug, and both were now trying to find ways to manage their habits without completely abandoning their responsibilities to family and profession. Their conversations during long afternoons at Mother Chen's revealed the ways that opium addiction crossed all social boundaries in Shanghai during this period. Zhang's academic knowledge and Liu's street wisdom complemented each other as they discussed strategies for managing withdrawal symptoms, techniques for maintaining work performance while under the influence, and methods for concealing their drug use from family members and colleagues. Zhang found that Liu's practical approach to problem solving offered insights that his scholarly training had not provided. The rickshaw puller's direct, uncomplicated view of addiction as a medical condition to be managed rather than a moral failing to be overcome helped Zhang reduce the guilt and self-recrimination that had been complicating his own recovery efforts. Liu, for his part, discovered that Zhang's analytical approach to understanding addiction provided useful frameworks for thinking about his own experiences. The professor's ability to identify patterns and connections helped Liu recognize triggers and cycles in his drug use that he had not previously noticed, information that proved valuable in planning strategies for gradual reduction. Their friendship also provided both men with someone who could understand their experiences without judgment or advice based on incomplete information. Family members and colleagues, however well-intentioned, could not truly comprehend the physical and psychological realities of opium dependence without having experienced them personally. The support they provided each other became even more important when both men faced crisis situations that tested their commitment to recovery. Zhang's crisis came when the Academy's administration decided that his leave of absence had been insufficient to address his performance problems and that more dramatic action would be required. The decision was communicated to Zhang through a formal letter that arrived at his family home while he was spending the day at Mother Chen's establishment. His wife opened the letter in his absence, learning simultaneously that her husband was losing his position and that his whereabouts during his supposed recovery period were unknown to her. Zhang returned home that evening to find his wife waiting with the letter and a list of questions about where he had been spending his time and what he had been doing to address the problems that had led to his professional difficulties. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful experiences of Zhang's life, as he was forced to reveal the extent of his addiction to someone whose respect and love he valued above everything else. His wife's reaction was not the anger or disgust that Zhang had feared, but rather a profound sadness that seemed to encompass not just his current situation, but the loss of the future they had planned together. She spoke quietly about their dreams of his eventual promotion to department head, their hopes for travel and cultural enrichment that his academic career might provide, their expectations that his scholarly work would contribute something meaningful to Chinese intellectual life. The collapse of these dreams was devastating for both of them, but it also marked the beginning of a new kind of honesty in their relationship. Zhang's wife began to understand that his addiction was not a choice he had made to escape his responsibilities, but rather a condition that had developed despite his best efforts to maintain control over his life. This understanding allowed her to become an active partner in Zhang's recovery, rather than simply a victim of his addiction's consequences. She began researching treatment options, managing their finances to support gradual reduction programs, and creating household routines that minimized Zhang's exposure to stress and temptation. Her support proved crucial when Zhang faced the decision of whether to continue his gradual reduction program or attempt complete abstinence despite the risks involved. The financial pressures created by his job loss made it difficult to continue purchasing opium even for medical purposes, while the social stigma of his condition made it unlikely that he would find new employment in his field. Zhang's decision to attempt complete withdrawal was motivated as much by practical necessity as by personal determination. He simply could not afford to maintain his habit indefinitely, and his wife's willingness to support him through the difficult process of detoxification gave him hope that recovery might be possible. The withdrawal process was every bit as difficult as Zhang had feared. The physical symptoms were manageable with his wife's careful attention to his nutrition and comfort, but the psychological challenges nearly broke his resolve on multiple occasions. Without opium to buffer his emotions, Zhang was forced to confront the full weight of his professional failure, social humiliation, and uncertain future. The drug had been protecting him from feelings of shame, anxiety, and despair that now returned with overwhelming intensity. There were days when Zhang felt that death would be preferable to continuing to endure such psychological torment. But his wife's constant presence and encouragement helped him persevere through the worst periods of his withdrawal. She reminded him daily of his strengths and accomplishments, of the reasons why their life together was worth fighting for, and of the possibility that recovery might open doors to opportunities they had not previously considered. Zhang's recovery was also supported by his friendship with Liu. who continued to visit him at home during the most difficult weeks of his withdrawal. The rickshaw puller's practical advice about managing physical symptoms and his unwavering belief in Zhang's ability to overcome his addiction provided crucial encouragement during moments when the professor felt ready to abandon his recovery efforts. Liu's own situation had stabilized somewhat during this period, as his gradual reduction program had succeeded in decreasing his daily opium consumption while allowing him to continue working. His family had adjusted to their reduced circumstances, and Maifeng's sewing work had provided enough additional income to keep them financially stable. But Liu's recovery was tested when his oldest son, a boy of 14, began showing signs of following his father's path toward addiction. The boy had been working as a messenger in Shanghai's commercial district, earning small amounts of money that helped support the family, while learning skills that might eventually lead to better employment. The messenger work exposed Liu's son to the same social pressures and physical demands that had contributed to his father's addiction. Long days of running through crowded streets, dealing with difficult customers, and managing the stress of adult responsibilities had left the boy exhausted and looking for relief. When the boy began staying out late and showing the telltale signs of opium use, Liu was forced to confront the possibility that his own addiction had created conditions that made his son vulnerable to the same problems. The cycle of addiction was threatening to repeat itself in the next generation, potentially trapping Liu's entire family in patterns of dependence and degradation. Liu's response to his son's situation revealed the depth of his own recovery and his commitment to protecting his family from the consequences of addiction. Despite the financial hardship it would create, Liu made the decision to leave Shanghai entirely, moving his family to a smaller city where opium would be less available and where they could build new lives free from the associations and pressures that had contributed to their problems. The decision required Liu to abandon the only work he had ever known and to start over in an unfamiliar place without the social connections that had sustained his family through previous difficulties. But Liu understood that staying in Shanghai would almost certainly result in both his own relapse and his son's continued descent into addiction. Liu's departure from Shanghai marked the end of his friendship with Zhang, but both men understood that their relationship had served its purpose in helping them through critical periods of their recovery. They had provided each other with understanding, support, and practical advice at times when such assistance was desperately needed. Zhang's recovery continued more smoothly after Liu's departure, as the professor found new sources of meaning and purpose that did not depend on his former academic status. He began offering private tutoring to students from families who valued traditional Chinese learning, work that allowed him to use his scholarly knowledge while avoiding the institutional pressures that had contributed to his addiction. His wife's support remained constant throughout this period, as she helped him rebuild his sense of self-worth and professional identity around different priorities and goals. Zhang discovered that teaching individual students could be more personally satisfying than the impersonal lecture halls where he had previously worked, as he was able to form closer relationships with his pupils and to see more immediate results from his educational efforts. The income from tutoring was modest compared to Zhang's former salary, but it was sufficient to support a simpler lifestyle that both he and his wife found more authentic and sustainable than their previous social climbing and status consciousness. They moved to a smaller house in a quieter neighborhood, where Zhang could work without the constant reminders of his former position and its associated pressures. Zhang's story of recovery was not unique during this period, as many individuals throughout Shanghai were finding ways to break free from opium addiction and rebuild their lives around different priorities and relationships. The social changes that had made addiction so widespread were also creating new opportunities for recovery and personal transformation. Religious organizations, both Christian and Buddhist, were developing programs specifically designed to help addicts achieve sobriety through spiritual practice and community support. These programs recognized that addiction was not simply a medical problem, but a spiritual and social crisis that required comprehensive approaches, addressing all aspects of human experience. Medical professionals were also beginning to understand addiction as a treatable condition rather than a moral failing, developing new approaches to withdrawal management and long-term recovery support. The combination of traditional Chinese medicine techniques with Western pharmaceutical knowledge was producing more effective treatments that address both physical dependence and psychological aspects of addiction. Most importantly, families and communities were learning to respond to addiction with compassion and practical support, rather than shame and rejection. The recognition that addiction could affect anyone, regardless of character or social status, was reducing the stigma that had prevented many people from seeking help or accepting treatment. But these positive developments existed alongside the ongoing tragedy of widespread addiction that continued to affect thousands of individuals and families throughout Shanghai and beyond. For every success story, like Zhang's gradual recovery or Liu's successful relocation, there were many more cases where addiction continued to progress toward more serious consequences. The opium dens remained busy despite increased government pressure and social disapproval, serving customers whose needs for the drug outweighed their concerns about legal or social consequences. Mother Chen's establishment continued to operate, though with greater discretion and higher prices that reflected the increased risks involved in the trade. New customers replaced those who had died, recovered, or moved away, ensuring that the demand for opium remained constant even as individual users came and went. The drug's grip on Chinese society was strong enough to survive individual recoveries, government crackdowns, and social reform movements that aimed to address the problem comprehensively. The stories of people like Zhang and Liu represented hope within a larger tragedy, examples of what was possible for individuals who found the strength, support, and circumstances necessary to break free from addiction. But their success also highlighted how difficult recovery remained for those who lacked similar advantages of education, family support, or economic resources. The interconnected nature of Shanghai's opium epidemic meant that individual recoveries, while personally meaningful, did little to address the broader social and economic forces that continued to create new addicts faster than existing ones could be helped to recover. The problem required solutions at the level of policy, economics, and social organization that would take decades to develop and implement. Meanwhile, the human cost continued to mount as addiction claimed new victims and destroyed families throughout the region. Each individual story of suffering represented not just personal tragedy, but also the loss of human potential that might have contributed to China's development and modernization during this crucial period in the nation's history. The complexity of the opium crisis reflected broader challenges facing Chinese society as it struggled to adapt to changing economic conditions, foreign influence, and social disruption that characterized the early 20th century. The drug that promised to solve individual problems had become a symbol of larger problems that required collective solutions. But within this larger context, the individual stories of struggle and recovery retained their importance as examples of human resilience and the possibility of personal transformation, even under the most difficult circumstances. The courage displayed by people like Zhang, Liu, Little Swallow, and Mei Lin in confronting their addictions and working toward recovery represented the kind of individual determination that would eventually contribute to broader social change. Their experiences would become part of the historical record, not as statistics or policy examples, but as human stories that revealed the real impact of addiction on individuals, families, and communities. These stories would help future generations understand not just what happened during Shanghai's opium crisis, but how it felt to live through it and what it cost in human terms. The legacy of their struggles would extend far beyond their individual outcomes, contributing to a growing understanding of addiction as a medical and social problem that required compassionate, comprehensive approaches to prevention and treatment. Their willingness to share their experiences and support others facing similar challenges helped create the foundation for more effective responses to addiction that would develop in subsequent decades. In this way, the tragic stories of Shanghai's opium addicts became part of a larger story of social learning and adaptation, as Chinese society gradually developed better ways to understand and address the complex challenges posed by widespread drug addiction. The suffering they endured was not meaningless if it contributed to knowledge and approaches that could help prevent similar tragedies in the future.